Thank you, Matt. I would have eaten a little bit less if I'd known I had to be funny and engaging. All right, let me just see if I've got my tech working. Okay, so thanks so much, Matt, for that lovely intro, and of course for the invitation to be here. Thanks also to Joe, and thanks to Steve for the lovely welcome, and thank you for all being here. And I do want to also mention that this talk is very much in dialogue with the American Vandal podcast, which I absolutely think is really the most interesting thing happening in literary criticism right now. And I did think that even before I was a guest on the program. So I'm excited to kind of think about how this is in dialogue with the conversation that is happening there. So if you're not listening to this season, you sure should be. All right, I think I've got about 40 minutes, and so I should get started. My central claim today is that The Gilded Age is perhaps the exemplary historical novel of the present. That it did in fact end up naming the period in question is an obvious clue that it performed a powerful mediating function, putting into aesthetic form a still nascent moment of economic and political change. This is an aesthetic goal that, as Alexander Menschel has recently noted and has come up in the podcast recently, can sometimes seem abandoned in our own contemporary moment, thanks to recent novelists chasing the critical prestige of the past in the form of the historical novel. For Frederick Jameson, reading Lukács, the 19th century historical novel was of course always to some degree a history of the present, giving bourgeois readers a sense of their own historicity, which then waned in the postmodern period. The loss of this mediating function left postmodern readers unmoored. Following Harry Haroutunian, however, we could say that some versions of historicity themselves obscure the present, narrating the present as the logical endpoint of progressive history. Twain and Warner's hyper-present novel, on the contrary, captures more precisely the truly emergent structures of feeling that Raymond Williams has taught us are those affective traces of practical consciousness that take precarious form before objectification into settled narrative and thus are central to understanding the present as it is actually lived and felt. The shape of this paper is a little weird. The ghost of Mark Twain came to me at Quarry Farm last night and told me it was all going to be fine, so I'm going to stick with it. I intend to think through this question of what it would mean to take seriously the idea of a historical novel of the present, and how the concept structures of feeling can help us to grapple with the complexities and instabilities of the novel's satirical tone. I will ultimately argue that cruel optimism, which Lauren Berlant explicitly linked to the notion of structures of feeling, the problem of the present, and to the genre of the historical novel, is the best name for the Gilded Age's nascent emotional structures, as long as we recognize key differences with Berlant's contemporary form. In their account, 20th and 21st century aesthetic objects mediate post-Fordist affect, specifically as a response to what they call the waning genres of the good life. Existing narrative structures of upward mobility, reliable intimacy, and stable institutions have frayed amid, for example, the collapse of the welfare state's social contract. In their stead, the new genres of cruel optimism offer micro-melodramas of small-scale adjustment, continuity, and carrying on. I will show how the Gilded Age captures a much earlier moment in this story of cruel optimism, when both the capital and capital, Washington, D.C., and speculative finance encouraged what still seem like plausible fantasies of heroic enlargement, spectacular upward mobility, monumentalized political sovereignty. With complex consequences, the novel both punctures and labors to sustain the genres that uphold those fantasies. In so doing, it may in fact help us address some vexing questions about political agency that continue to trouble theories of cruel optimism. A key question in early responses to The Gilded Age was whether it is a joke about the novel or a novel. In other words, is its primary goal to satirize the conventions of sentimental and sensational literature, and thus it takes the shape of a novel in parodic form only? Or does the novel have aspirations to be a novel, a better sort of novel, whose improvements on the form will also offer a comparative critique? In 1874, the editors of the journal Heart and Home expressed their disorientation, expecting, quote, a burlesque of the modern novel, peculiarly rich in the characteristics of both its authors, but finding, continuing the quote, instead as genuine a novel as any, full of humor, but on the whole rather a pathetic than a humorous production. Later critics were more certain of the book's satiric aims. In 1954, Everett Carter called the novel, quote, an attack in fiction upon sentimentalism in literature as it operated in the social and economic and political life in America. But in a book-length treatment of the novel published in 1965, Bryant Morey French staked a stronger claim for the book's interest. He certainly positions Twain as, quote, an outspoken foe of sentimentalism, sensationalism, and the literature of illusion in general. But for French, the resulting book does not merely hold a mirror to the excesses of the novel form as it exists, but rather hearkens the next phase of the novel form's maturation in America. Specifically, French argues that amid the unprecedented increase of frontier exploitation and resulting graft, and corresponding threats to social and political values, literature often offered only the emotional tranquilizer of sentiment and sensation. Specifically, French argues that amid the unprecedented increase of exploitation, etc., under such historical and literary conditions, a reaction became inevitable, a resurgence of realism, a swing to literature of actual contemporary life with an indigenous American base. Indeed, French claims that the novel helped to, quote, bring about the onset of critical realism, a striking causal claim he later repeats and expands. Quote, should I try this again, do you think? Oh, I don't want to do that to you. Okay, all right. Yeah, advance then. The Gilded Age, then, standing as it does at the entrance of the road along which American social realism was to travel, almost solitary as a guidepost in the midst of uncultivated fields, is a significant landmark in United States literary history. In bitterly parodying the tepid morality of the sentimental novel and the overtly immoral and tawdry pleasures of the sensation novel, Twain and Warner end up, in this account, modeling a style of realist expose that would soon take shape as the social realism of turn-of-the-century literature. In a reversal and revision of Marx's famous formula about history repeating itself first as tragedy, then as farce, we might now say first as farce, then as realism. I will have more to say about the tension here between satire and realism, but for the moment I want to emphasize the temporality of French's claim. For him, The Gilded Age is a kind of realist novel in embryo. Responding to complex historical and aesthetic pressures, it mobilizes a disorienting mix of satire and realism that would only later solidify into a more stable genre associated with a more legible epic, say, progressive-era reform fiction. By imagining an emergent genre responding to an emergent epic, and doing so either in spite of or perhaps because of its instabilities of tone, French's reading practically begs for a concept that would find its direct articulation around 10 years later, Raymond Williams's Structure of Feeling. Okay, a refresher. Williams's chapter on Structure of Feeling, which if you were to click the spacebar, you will see a picture of the book, Structures of Marxism and Literature, follows immediately after his discussion of dominant, residual, and emergent historical and cultural epistemes, ideologies, and processes. He thus makes clear that the concept will help illustrate the importance of understanding any given moment as, to be sure, marked by dominant epistemological and ideological formations, but also, quote, internal dynamic relations, amongst modes of thought and experience on the wane and on the rise. Here, too, he articulates the notion of practical consciousness that will come to feature in the definition of structures of feeling, those thoughts, feelings, skills, and habits that orient us toward the world. These are facets of experience that a, quote, dominant social order neglects, excludes, represses, or simply fails to recognize. This brings us to the concept in question, which for Williams names a kind of feeling and thinking which is indeed social and material, but each in an embryonic phase before it can become fully articulate and defined exchange. You might not want to get too comfortable, because now we're really getting into it. So if you could hit that one for me, and then in fact another one will be coming up shortly. Williams admits the term is somewhat difficult, but stresses that perhaps the term feeling is chosen to emphasize a distinction from more formal concepts of worldview or ideology. Instead, if you would, we are concerned with meanings and values as they are actively lived and felt. Williams also admits that structures of feeling might be the better term. Williams admits that structures of experience might be the better term, except it risks slipping back into the past tense that the concept is designed to resist, and that part of the problem the term addresses is that feelings are a domain, if you would click it once again, social experience which is still in process, often indeed not yet recognized as social, but taken to be private, idiosyncratic, and even isolating, but which in analysis has its emergent, connecting, and dominant characteristics. It bears noting that despite his efforts to ward off confusion or protest, Williams's term is often considered slippery by both detractors and fans. In an oft-cited essay, David Simpson, for example, accuses Williams of a, quote, confusion of focus. On the one hand, the structure of feeling is said to correspond to, quote, the dominant social character. On the other hand, it designates ideology in ferment or in transition, with an emphasis on a notion of agency emanating from the consciousness of the artist. I disagree for reasons I hope to make clear, but to be fair, even sympathetic engagements with structures of feeling lend some credence to the idea that it may be too well covered by other terms. Glenn Hendler's brilliant book, Public Sentiments, Structures of Feeling in 19th Century American Literature, treats, quote, the experience of sympathetic identification as the narrative and affective core of a sentimental structure of feeling. But I'm not sure that one can define sentimentality as a structure of feeling, given its remarkable generic stability in the sentimental novel, a dominant literary form keyed to dominant modes of liberal sentiment with relatively stable conventions, even if fluid, like all genres. So too, Jonathan Flatley's affective mapping may well damn the concept with strong praise. He argues, I do not think structures of feeling should be a supplementary term, and I will argue that they can be just as durable and forceful as ideologies, perhaps even more so. If the function of an ideology is to narrate our relation to a social order, so as to make our daily experience of that order meaningful and manageable, then structure of feeling would be the term to describe the mediating structure, one just as socially produced as ideology, that facilitates and shapes our affective attachments. I think this is a common way of using the term. One wants to talk about ideology, stressing a visceral component. But the concept of ideology already contains notions of embodied feelings and practices, and so I worry that the term here in fact comes to seem more supplemental, merely one inflection of ideology. This is why, to my mind, more successful deployments of the concept focus specifically on the fleeting and the nascent. For Michael Denning in The Cultural Front, I wouldn't have included so many slides that were just like a shot of the cover if I'd known I had to make poor Joe jump every time I got to them. The Popular Front could be seen as a structure of feeling because its temporality was not of the stable decade or the epoch, a question of periodization that will resonate with scholars of the Gilded Age, the period, and the Gilded Age, the novel. Denning writes, to name a period, the Depression, the 30s, the New Deal, the Age of Roosevelt, modernism, the streamlined years, is already to argue about it. For Denning, what matters most is that different frameworks differently mark beginnings and endings, differently narrate successes and failures, if you would. That the moment of the Popular Front, the age of the CIO, is usually visible only as an interregnum, a dead end, the 30s, is a result, I suggest, of its seeming to fall outside those larger stories of modernism and postmodernism, Fordism and post-Fordism. It was not another epoch, but a promise of a different road beyond modernism, a road not taken, a vanishing mediator. Structures of feeling enable a view of the Popular Front not as linked to a discrete decade that is simply a failure of a particular kind of left radicalism, but rather a broader generational set of critiques and concerns of modern life that need to be recuperated as a resource for critique. This brings me to one of the best defenses of the concept. Thomas Laughlin, in a chapter in the excellent Raymond Williams at 100 collection, fundamentally sees the notion of structure of feeling as intervening in Marxist-based superstructure models. For Laughlin, Williams is absolutely a Marxist. He understands the economic conditions as having a strong determining factor on the cultural superstructure. But at the same time, language is material, and the concepts that we use to shape reality as we encounter it. And so artistic practice is mediating a set of conditions in a way that also potentially transforms them, or in any case is not merely a reflection of that base, even though such shifts are not inherently revolutionary. The great benefit of this concept for Laughlin is that it hereby helps develop a basis for, next slide please, Marxist literary criticism that reads literature neither proleptically, that is by the standard of what a future society needs and wants, nor deterministically as a mere reflection, however inverted, of society's economic base. Instead, Williams approaches the work of art as both practice and creation, from the standpoint of the artist situated within a whole way of life, producing, if not an exact knowledge or science of that totality, then at least a sense of its operation, artistically mediated, and, if successfully communicated, potentially shared. Like all the best readings of the concept, then, Laughlin insists on the connection of structures of feeling to emergent processes. It is specifically the nascent, grasping, uncertain nature of a structure of feeling that captures how an aesthetic object may be trying to represent historical processes that have not fully come into view. It is also a model for a dialectical historicism, and this is the response to the Simpsons critique quoted earlier, that sees creative works actively mediating the conditions that shape them, allowing for critical engagement in utopian imaginings. This brings us at last to the novel. In Twain and Warner's narrative, how do feelings mark the problem of historicizing the present? In what ways do affects index the improvisatory acclamation to historical processes in flux? Since I've taken a substantial detour to Raymond Williams, let me remind you of the shape of Twain and Warner's tale. I was almost going to take a poll to see, like, do we want plot summary? But I'm just going to give plot summary, because... The novel begins by recounting impoverished farmer Silas Hawkins's fantasies of the wealth to be gained from the sale of his family's Tennessee property. Silas dies before these dreams come to fruition, and his family disperses, with each child setting off to seek his or her own fortune. Laura, accepted into the family in the aftermath of a steamboat explosion, travels to Washington, D.C. with her brother, Washington. In the capital, Laura hopes to use her significant beauty and charm as a lobbyist and convince the government to purchase the family's land. Meanwhile, the chapters authored by Warner relate the exploits of two young friends, Harry Brierly and Philip Sterling, seeking their fortunes out west. The stories are united by Colonel Beriah Sellers, a lovable but compulsively speculative businessman and inventor who is Silas Hawkins's oldest friend. Sellers goes into business with Sterling and Brierly, and he mentors Laura in the art of politics. The plot's tracks converge in Washington, D.C., where nearly all of the characters' fortunes rise or fall with the fate of the Knobs University Bill and Colonel Sellers' Columbus River Navigation Fund, two corrupt schemes intended to persuade the government to purchase or improve land of questionable value. Thanks to Laura's successful lobbying, the bill seems on the point of passing until damaging gossip arises surrounding her resumed relations with Colonel Selby, a man who had previously tricked her into a sham marriage before abandoning her. Abandoned a second time, Laura boards a train to New York, finds Selby in a hotel lobby, and shoots him dead. The subsequent trial hinges on the question of Laura's sanity or insanity. She is ultimately acquitted and takes to the lecture circuit to capitalize on her popularity, but dies almost immediately of nervous strain after her premiere performance is disrupted by a boisterous and insulting mob. With his political schemes in shambles, Washington sells the Tennessee land that has proven more curse than blessing. Meanwhile, Sterling strikes coal and at last and promptly marries. Perhaps a way of tracking the affects that circulate in this text would be to make use of images from the novel. And you're going to really earn your dinner now, because this is just going to be we're going to just go through a bunch of slides really quickly. And the point here is that these images are going to be in such fast succession that they're going to be disorienting, and it's not really clear where the images are from, and that's kind of the point. So if you would just kind of click one, there's a Gilded Age, you can go to the next one. This is, Hawkins sort of like, debating whether he should sell the land. You can go to another one. Maybe actually the land is going to be more worth more money, so the stock is rising. Could do the next one. Colonel Sellers the caption is Colonel Sellers blowing bubbles for Washington, evoking his classic capacity to kind of conjure incredible schemes in the air. Could do the next one. Colonel Sellers despondent, a rare moment of like depression and sort of disappointment for Sellers. You can do the next one. Consuming love. In my book, I talk a lot about how across Twain's works, and also thinking about Harry Beecher Stowe, a kind of nervousness about whether love is going to like bind people to social forms or is like a radical consuming passion. And so here I have Consuming Love. Children of Hope, miscellaneous like poor people, but an interesting title. Do the next one. Object of Sympathy. There's a lot in the novel. It's about people's over-readiness to extend sympathy when it's not warranted, and the kinds of problems that leads to. Come on now, let's cheer up. Another moment of sadness. Again, the just utter sort of despondency of Colonel Sellers in Washington returning home after a vote doesn't go their way, and Court and Scene, another scene of like popular passion and public kind of sexuality entering the public sphere in an alarming way, similar with a popular endorsement. Okay, we can stop there. Thank you. These illustrate, this is like budget, like sentiment analysis. Like if I was a digital humanist, I would have just given you a chart of like all the like word bubbles of the feelings, but instead I just made Joe do a, like a flip book. These illustrations index with a surprising degree of granularity how central affect or emotion is to the narrative of the Gilded Age. Viewed in fast succession and out of context, we get something of a kineograph of the wild fluctuations of feeling dramatized within the text, and also something of the striking stability of the text tone. Each moment of speculative enthusiasm is met with crushing defeat and exhaustion. Each moment of political optimism is met with disgusted disenchantment. Each occasion for sympathetic identification is revealed to be mistaken and misplaced. Every broadly popular passion is shown to be evidence of mass delusion. This pervasive tone of disillusioned bitterness is what I addressed in my book, Not Quite Hope and Other Political Emotions in the Gilded Age, under the heading of cynicism, which Peter Sloterdijk famously characterizes as pervasive, defensive, and melancholy bitterness that nonetheless does not challenge the status quo. If you could go to the next slide. In his account, cynicism is a posture by which enlightened people see to it that they are not taken for suckers. For Sloterdijk, cynicism is enlightened false consciousness, which describes an attitude of apathetic knowledge. It has learned its lessons in enlightenment, but it has not put them into practice. Well off and miserable at the same time, this consciousness no longer feels affected by any critique of ideology. Its falseness is already reflexively buffered. Sloterdijk's theory of cynicism came to English language critical theory, in part via Slavoj Žižek, for whom Sloterdijk's formulation was useful because it weans critics of the notion that ideology can be understood as something like a bad set of thoughts in our heads, which might be corrected by better, truer knowledge. If, for Sloterdijk, to act against better knowledge defines the cynical tenor of our global situation, for Žižek this underscores the way ideology is always materialized in action. Žižek writes, "We must avoid the simple metaphors of demasking because we are fetishists in practice, not belief." It was engagement with this aspect of Žižek's reading that in turn brought Sloterdijk's theory of cynicism into even more mainstream use in unacknowledged form. If you could get us one more picture of a book. Via Mark Fisher's notion of capitalist realism, often shorthanded as the belief that it is now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative to capitalism. Fisher's text is also more precisely an account of why that is so. In short, capitalist realism describes the fact that mass culture now, next slide please, performs our anti-capitalism for us, allowing us to continue to consume with impunity. The role of capitalist ideology is not to make an explicit case for something in the way that propaganda does, but to conceal the fact that the operations of capital do not depend on any sort of subjectively assumed belief. Cynical knowledge of corruption, exploitation, violence becomes a mode of acclimatization. We know everything is corrupt. The decks are all stacked against us, but at least we're not taken for suckers. Sloterdijk's book remains an interesting and perhaps underused resource for humor studies. And this is like one of my like little mini nods to the theme of the conference. You're all like wanted to hear about Twain and laughter, and I'm just like, here's Marxism. A central question for Sloterdijk is whether there is a cynicism, so with a K, derived from the ancient Greek cynics like Diogenes, which represents a much more radical, bodily, and performative form of critique. The cynic, in Sloterdijk's account, rejects social norms and conventions through scandalous bodily and material provocations. But a way of thinking about cynicism and humor with more direct application to the Gilded Age comes into view by thinking about the resonances between capitalist realism and what Aaron Matz has called satirical realism. In effect, Matz is interested in the ways Victorian realism increasingly took on more of the impulse to expose and ridicule that we might associate with satire, but in so doing weakened its critical political power. I think you can advance through an image of the book to the next slide. Yeah, one more. Perfect. Augustan satire and Victorian realism appear to have very different aims. The first wants to ridicule man, the second seems to want to portray him with sympathy. But both want to expose him. All that satire needs to do in its mission to detect the ridiculous or the corrupt is remove the garments that cloak the most basic truths. But this kind of detection, this discovery of the cutaneous reality, is equally native to realist fiction and its exposure and description of everyday fact. The problem for Matz comes when the two genres become one. When realism and satire merge, they cease to be political, at least in any recognizable way, because they arrive at a recognition that politics is no longer an option. Politics suggests progress, and progress suggests correction, but satirical realism is the art of absolute disillusionment. Satirical realism again recalls Sloterdijkian cynicism and Fisher's capitalist realism. Modes of disillusion, which, as I argued in my book, is so pithily condensed in the title of The Gilded Age, that lasting invocation of a false veneer in need of surgical unmasking. But there is an even more specific way that Matz identifies a representational problem for satire and for realism that, I think, both highlights a major tension in the novel, The Gilded Age, but also provides room for its recuperation as a powerfully subtle dramatization of Gilded Age structures of feeling. This comes when Matz notes that all the writers in his study face the problem of how widely they should cast their satiric net. Next slide, please. In general, it is individuation that yields understanding and clemency. We are predisposed to forgive the individual. This, indeed, is one of our inherited lessons regarding the fiction of George Eliot, but satire, at least the essential and wide-ranging satire that I am discussing here, is typically in the hunt for shared folly, for mankind's collective error, and is therefore more interested in people than in the person. Satirical realism, that hybrid mode, embodies a representational dilemma, a dilemma of person and people. It wants to depict the individualized human person in all her idiosyncrasy, and yet it wants to scorn all mankind. In my book, I talked extensively about the problem that Laura Hawkins and Colonel Sellers pose for the novel, how these key figures oscillate so wildly between protagonist and villain. Laura is the victim of reckless competition in a steamboat explosion, later seduced and abandoned by a philandering rake. Yet she also comes to emblematize women's fickle nature and moral failings, and the susceptibility of American democracy to the contaminating influence of money and sex. Inversely, Sellers so often looks like a dangerous embodiment of America's speculative ethos. Yet he is also the novel's moral center, revealing an indefatigable, why would I ever put that in a talk? Generosity and optimism that offsets the novel's relentless cynicism. Matz's framework might encourage us to see a realism-satire tension here, where each character is individualized and rendered sympathetic, but also stands as a satiric emblem of some more general folly. In the process of this merger, following Matz anyway, we would say, we are left only with an apolitical, satirical realism. But it's here that we might think more seriously about the novel as not only realist, but as a particular form of the historical novel. This inflection of genre is important for several reasons, but most immediately because it offers a different model of characterological exemplarity. Neither the realist novel's individuation for the sake of empathic identification, nor satire's universalizing moral generalizing, but a specifically historical abstraction. After all, The Gilded Age begins with a sense that the entire narrative to come will be one of economic transformation. Transformations that will be indexed by the ways everyday characters respond to and adapt to them. Slide, please. This is from the very beginning of the novel. It's Silas Hawkins. Nancy, you've heard of steamboats, and maybe you believed in them. Of course you did. They're going to make a revolution in this world's affairs that will make men dizzy to contemplate. I've been watching while some people slept, and I know what's coming. And this is not all, Nancy. It isn't even half. There's a bigger wonder, the railroad. In scenes like this, the novel perfectly captures the role of the 19th century historical novel as theorized by George Lukács, measuring large-scale social transformations through narratives that focus on the ordinary people who navigate them. Interestingly, it's a chapter of The Gilded Age, I believe, that's authored by Warner, that both debuts and betrays the novel's more overt aspirations to be a historical novel. Chapter 18 begins with a break of 10 years, if you could go to the next slide. And it's actually like kind of rude that the American Vandal podcast ended up talking about this exact passage while I was trying to write this talk, which is not fair. The 8 years in America from 1860 to 1868 uprooted institutions that were centuries old, changed the politics of a people, transformed the social life of half the country, and wrought so profoundly upon the entire national character that the influence cannot be measured short of 2 or 3 generations. As we are accustomed to interpret the economy of providence, the life of the individual is as nothing to that of the nation or the race. But who can say, in the broader view and the more intelligent weight of values, that the life of one man is not more than that of a nationality, and that there is not a tribunal where the tragedy of one human soul shall not seem more significant than the overturning of any human institution whatever? Warner manages to invoke the scope of history only to collapse it into the tragedy of one human soul. Rather than seeing a human life as condensing the effects of transformed institutions, the individual is instead pitted against and ultimately redirects our gaze from a sense of the historical as a process unfolding in the present. Twain, on the other hand, less overtly but more interestingly historicizes the present. And he does so in a way that hinges precisely on a certain structure of feeling, a complex historicity dramatized by everyday affect. In a key exchange between Sellers and his wife, for example, the present emerges through tension between present austerity and future plenitude. Just stop and fancy a moment, just think a little. This is Colonel Sellers. Don't anything suggest itself? Bless your heart, you dear women, live right in the present all the time. But a man, why a man lives in the future, Beriah? But don't we live in the future most too much, Beriah? We do somehow seem to manage to live on next year's crop of corn and potatoes as a general thing, while this year is still dragging along. But sometimes it's not a robust diet, Beriah. The present is felt as that which is sacrificed for the future, a dynamic that precisely evokes Berlant's later notion of cruel optimism, an attachment to narratives of future mobility, wealth, etc., that are an obstacle to flourishing in the here and now. For Berlant, we might remember, cruel optimism is explicitly an attempt to theorize the present, in direct dialogue with Williams. You could do the next slide for me. Oh, one more. Thank you. One of this book's central claims, they write, is that the present is perceived first affectively. The present is what makes itself present to us before it becomes anything else, such as an orchestrated collective event or an epoch on which we can look back. Berlant then reminds us that not only Williams, but also Lukács, Jameson, and Benedict Anderson have all, next slide please, have all cast historicism via the historical novel as the aesthetic expression of an affective epistemology, an encounter with the historical present via the intensities of its tone, whether emergent, chaotic, or waning. If Berlant's work thus directly authorizes my cluster of concerns with feeling, history, and the novel, it also provides an occasion to mark the Gilded Age's difference from the 19th century historical novel in its classical form, as well as the 21st century version that Berlant identifies. First, as I signaled in my introduction, we should note that the historical novel has always been a genre that both theorizes but also obscures the present. For Jameson, in Nostalgia for the Present, postmodernism entails a diminishment of our ability to grasp the present as a historical moment. This is what he calls historicity. This is contrasted to an earlier situation in which, drawing from Lukács, the historical novel presented the past in such a way that it clarified the socio-political and economic realities of the present for its audience. It, quote, provided figuration for the new and equally emergent sense of history of the triumphant middle classes. But as Harry Haroutunian reminds us in an essay entitled Remembering the Historical Present, capitalism homogenizes time into a uniform march of progress. But in fact, histories of class antagonism and colonialism mean that people occupy multiple points temporally. And so one kind of grasp of the past obscures our capacity to sense the present. Haroutunian calls this non-contemporaneous contemporaneity. Under capitalism, modern industrialized society may experience a sense of rapid, progressive time marked by technological advancement and economic growth. At the same time, there are groups, often in colonized or marginalized regions, whose experiences of time are shaped by older modes of production, traditions, or cultural frameworks that haven't caught up to this industrial time. Capitalist ideology masks this complexity. Everyone is supposedly moving forward at the same pace toward the same future. For Berlant, then, we might say that recent genres of cruel optimism more fully capture the present precisely when the fantasy of structuring narratives have collapsed. Berlant theorizes novels and films from our contemporary moment as innovating what they call new, quote, genres of the stretched out present, in which an attention to slowness, stuckness, ongoingness stands in for lost older narratives of development, having a life and building a life. Instead, in Berlant's terms, quote, cruel optimism attempts to chronicle the dramas of adjustment, the dramas of consciousness and of mediated life, that force into being new recognitions of what a life is and ought to be. Importantly, however, this is not quite the cruel optimism of the Gilded Age. The acute cruelty of Gilded Age cruel optimism is that while the present is actually a scene of austere immiseration, it is perennially re-energized by the promise of an extravagant tomorrow. Further, if the form of the historical novel casts everyday people in a historical and often national allegory, the novel's particular focus on Washington, D.C. makes clear how the capital inspires fantasy in part as a scene of self-allegorization. Sellers, for example, practically bursts with delusions of grandiosity. Give me the slide for me. In D.C., the Colonel enjoyed this bustle and confusion amazingly. He thrived in the air of indefinite expectation. All his own schemes took larger shape and more misty and majestic proportions, and in this congenial air, the Colonel seemed even to himself to expand into something large and mysterious. Twain and Warner make clear that Sellers' delusion is merely an exaggeration of a general feature of life in the capital. People were introduced to each other as from this or that state, not from cities or towns, and this gave a largeness to their representative feeling. And of course, for Laura in particular, Washington, D.C. authorizes fantasies of political and financial power that will also lend a certain stability and meaning to her life. What I want is to go to Washington and find out what I am. The brilliance of the novel emerges in these scenes where it helps us to understand how, again, both the capital and capital, Washington, D.C., and the circuits of speculative finance operate as a site for allegorical fantasy. In a sense, this moment of post-Civil War government enlargement, westward expansion, speculative excess, widening inequality, occult mechanisms for the concentration of wealth, is a moment of the profound power of genres of the good life, upward mobility. Indeed, thanks to Warner's contribution, the novel in fact contains a Horatio Alger rags to riches Bildungsroman in the Philip Sterling narrative, which offers a moralized foil for the foibles of Sellers, Washington, Laura, etc. Yet the novel also punctures these myths at the very moment of their fullest power and attraction, more than a century before their later fraying. Through its complex tonal and generic instabilities, it manages to trouble the solidity and power of those genres and raise fraught questions about agency and optimism in a new moment of cynical capitalist realism. This is why I am forced to end somewhat embarrassingly by agreeing with myself. I've charted a different path through the novel than the one I pursued in my book. This is an important slide. If you could put that up and let that hang there for a little while. This really excellent book that I recommend. I have tried to think more about genre and structures of feeling to emphasize the book's unique attentiveness to the present. As discussed, the new dominance of the historical novel in our own moment may come at the cost of facing the present head-on. So while Twain and Warner's novel can be critiqued for its blind spots, it can also be celebrated for the way it precisely anticipates a strain of Marxist literary criticism and affect theory, from Williams to Berlant, that takes seriously the project of sensing new forms of consciousness, everyday practices of living history as it happens. But, and here's the agreeing with myself part, with this shift in emphasis, I feel even more convinced that Colonel Sellers' indefatigable, I can't believe I did it twice, indefatigable optimism holds a place for Twain as faint utopian edge to his bitterly cynical critique. After all, for all the benefits of Berlant's approach, we might worry over their celebration of these dramas of small-scale adjustment, accommodation, and lateral agency, against bad old forms of monumentalized sovereignty, grandiose fantasy. For sure, these practices are worthy of attention, but Sellers still looks to me like a figure that, at his best, holds a space for adaptation and aspiration, getting by and dreaming big, reaching and accommodating but also imagining. At the close of Cruel Optimism, Berlant himself appears to grow uncomfortable with the implications of lateral agency as a model for politics, reminding us that, I could do one more slide, I think this is the last one. The work of undoing a world while making one requires fantasy to motor programs of action, to distort the present on behalf of what the present can become. It requires a surrealistic affect sphere to counter the one that already exists, enabling a confrontation with the fact that any action of making a claim on the present involves bruising processes of detachment from anchors in the world, along with optimistic projections of a world that is worth our attachment to it. In a memorable passage, Twain writes, quote, "The colonel's tongue was a magician's wand that turned dried apples into figs and water into wine as easily as it could change a hovel into a palace and present poverty into imminent future riches." This capacity for grandiose fantasy, to conjure the present as the future that's almost here, is of course what makes him a beloved comic figure, but also an agent of cruel optimism, first as farce, then as tragedy. But in this historical novel of the present, one that tracks so precisely the waning of the promise of the good life, even or especially at a moment of its intensification through speculative fervor, Sellers's delusional hopes can also look like surrealistic structures of feeling, optimistic projections that serve a necessary check on the cynical paralysis of capitalist realism. Thanks.